Thank you, Harold, for that very kind introduction, and it's certainly a pleasure to be with you today. The stakes right now are high. You have a lot of priorities to work with, but the IAFF is recognized as a fierce advocate not only for the well-being of your members, but also in the front line of security for the public. And I've been lucky to be part of the advocacy efforts over the years, such as advocating for fire and safer grants, and voting to enact authorization and reauthorization for the 9/11 Health and Compensation Act. Your advocacy is essential because, and not only essential, but it's effective. And let me tell you, every time there's a rally, you can tell when those gold and black t-shirts are out there, you know firefighters are at the rally. So I want to thank you for all that you do. I want to first recognize, obviously, the President, Harold Schaitberger, Ed Kelly, Jim Lee, Kevin O'Connor, Shannon Misner, and Billy David for the leadership that you provide for the organization. Let me tell you, you are a strong group because of the leadership that you have. So I want to thank each and every one of those leaders. Now in Congress, we're working on a lot of different issues. Sometimes it's kind of hard to focus on the issues because we've gotten, the president's good at diversion. Every time we get focused on an issue, he comes up with Obama's wiretapping him, or his crowd was bigger, or 5 million illegal votes, one right after another, and so we get diverted. There's an old joke about which gets more attention. 2 United States senators walking down one side of the street, or 2 monkeys fighting on the other. And we got to be careful that we don't divert our attention to the monkey fights and all those kind of scurrilous allegations to make sure that we're focused on the issue. One of the first issues you have to focus on, of course, is the budget. And when you talk about the budget, I'm reminded of a member of the state Senate in Virginia, Ed Willie, who was a very conservative state senator. He was chair of the Finance Committee, and people hated him because he was so conservative. They said you couldn't get a dime out of him with a crowbar, and they just hated him. He showed up at a bar right before an election, and you could hear the people mumbling, "Oh, there go Ed Willie. Nobody in here going to vote for Ed Willie. Can't get a dime out of him with a crowbar." And they just mumbling on, and he grabbed his beer, lifted it up, turned to the bartender and said, "Bartender, when Ed Willie drinks, everybody drinks." People couldn't believe it. They started chanting, "Jolly good fellow. Oh, why are you talking bad about Ed Willie? He's got every vote in here, set up the house like that." And they were just celebrating, and he was just taking it in. And after a few minutes, he took a couple of dollars out of his pocket, put it on the bar, and said, "Bartender." Everybody looked up. "Bartender, when Ed Willie pays, everybody pays." So when they start talking about some nice tax cuts or things you like, just wait for the end, because when they start talking about increasing defense and cutting taxes, and that's how you're going to balance the budget, just remember there's something else in that formula. And so we need also to look at the right to organize. They're challenging times for those of us who believe in the right to organize and collectively bargain. We know that organizing working people makes a better life for those families, makes the workplace safer and healthier, and enables people to retire with dignity and security. We know union members on average make about $200 a week more than non-union members. Even children of union members do better than children of non-union members. But unfortunately, we see the new data in January shows that union membership is down in 2016, both in the public and private sectors. The drop in the public sector union membership is attributed primarily to declines in state and local government level, where Republican leaders in several states have worked to weaken the power of public employee unions. As you know, Kentucky and Missouri recently enacted so-called right-to-work laws. There are now 28 states with the right to freeload that have been signed into law. But there is good news. Tough work by groups like you blocked New Hampshire from advancing right to work a couple of weeks ago. And I'm proud that Virginia, when there was an opportunity to put right to work in the Constitution because of the leadership of groups like the firefighters, Virginia said no. It's fundamentally unfair to require unions to represent people who don't even cover the basic expenses of the representational activities, but are able to benefit and reap all the benefits. This is what motivates the right. We know what motivates the right to work laws, and that is cutting off the labor movement's resources to function in an effective way for all of their workers. Now, congressional leaders in Washington have a clear agenda. As one of my Republican colleagues recently was quoted as saying, labor has sort of lost its reason for being. I disagree. I think the reason for labor unions remains as clear and compelling as it's ever been. We know that union jobs have built and sustained a vibrant middle class. These middle class jobs didn't happen by accident. They happened because auto workers and postal workers and firefighters organized and negotiated for that good pay. Now, I commend the IAFF for weighing in to oppose the bill that would create a national right-to-work law. One leading co-sponsor of the bill, Joe Wilson of South Carolina, is a member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, where I serve as the ranking Democratic member. At a recent hearing, this anti-union bill did not escape the attention of Democratic members of the committee, who made it absolutely clear that free rider legislation undermines the middle class. Your voices are needed to push back on this bad idea before it gets much traction. And the states are equally important on the Supreme Court. Last year, we had a case seeking to overturn a 40-year-old Supreme Court precedent known as the Abood case that upheld the ability of public sector unions to charge a fair share fee to non-members to cover the cost of representational services. Now, just the cost of representational services that they will benefit from, not the politics, not the cookouts, just those things that are obligated by law for everybody for the union to provide and for everybody to benefit. That case is known as the Fredericks case. It was argued before the Supreme Court, and based on the oral argument, it looked like we were going to lose 5-4. And that would have created essentially a national right to work for unions representing firefighters, teachers, police, and sanitation workers at the state and local government. But before the final vote, a justice expired. And fortunately, we were able to win on a 4-4 tie. There are, unfortunately, 28 similar cases now working their way through the court, and including a high-profile case backed by the governor of Illinois, and this case is accepted by the Supreme Court. It will probably be heard after a 9th justice is confirmed. Now, here's what the Right to Work Committee has to say about the prospects of that 9th justice. Quote, "We think with the right justice, we could actually get a national right to work law for all government employees, thanks to the outcome of the last election." Now, for that reason, we need to pay particular attention to the hearings for Judge Neil Gorsuch, who has been nominated to the Supreme Court, and it's important that we make our voices heard on that nomination. Now, some of the same interests that are pushing national right to work are also behind the idea of taxing some, if not all, employer-provided health care benefits, as this is the single largest tax exclusion in the tax code. Now, it's simple arithmetic. If they're going to cut taxes for corporations and want to be revenue neutral, somebody's going to pay some more taxes. And so it's especially troublesome when we're talking about the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. Now, I support the Affordable Care Act and want to point out that it has done a lot of good. They can say it's been a disaster, but if you look at what the situation was before the Affordable Care Act passed, costs were going through the roof. Those with pre-existing conditions couldn't get any insurance. Women were paying more than men, and millions of people every year were losing their insurance. We passed the Affordable Care Act, and now the costs have still gone up, but at the lowest rate they've gone in 50 years. Those with pre-existing conditions can get insurance at the average cost. Women are not paying any more than men, and instead of millions of people losing their insurance, 20 million more people have insurance. Now, the full name of the Affordable Care Act is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and so we have patient protections like no caps on benefits. In the old days, once they paid about $250,000, they don't pay any more. You're on your own. You get prevention, no co-pays or deductibles. We're closing the donut hole. You talk to your senior citizens who have prescriptive drug coverage. You get nice little coverage up to a certain point. Then you go into the donut hole, no benefits at all, and you're on your own. And then you start getting benefits again. We're closing that donut hole. And those up to 26 can stay in their parents' policies. Now, if we're going to repeal, I think the public has caught on, you got to have something to replace it. Unfortunately, these guys have voted 60 times to repeal all the parts of the Affordable Care Act, no replacement in sight. But I think now people have figured out that there are too many benefits to give up. If you're going to repeal it, replace it. And one of the curious things now is they say they have a great replacement. That's everybody with pre-existing conditions will get coverage. The number of insured will stay the same or more. Prices will be lower. Only problem is nobody can find the bill. There was a spectacle last week where they said they had a bill at a certain room. Senator Rand Paul went over to see it. They wouldn't let him in the room. I don't think they have a replacement. But let's see, if they have a replacement that's better than what we've got, I'm for it. But unfortunately, they've got one problem that they're learning is if you're going to cover pre-existing conditions, you got to have a mandate. You have to force everybody to have insurance, because if people can wait until they get sick before they buy insurance, people will wait until they get sick before they buy insurance. The average cost goes up. Healthy people can't afford it, and they start dropping out. Sick people will pay whatever it costs to get the insurance. And they got a name for this process. It's called the death spiral, where expenses spiral out of control, like they were doing in New York. New York had a requirement that you could get insurance notwithstanding a pre-existing condition with no mandate. When the mandate came in, the cost for individual insurance went down more than 50%. Washington State tried it. By the time it was fully implemented, you can get insurance with a pre-existing condition, no mandate. It got to the point where nobody could buy individual insurance. And so they had to repeal that and fix it with a mandate. So let's see what their replacement is. If it's better, we're going to support it. If it's not, we're going to oppose it. But let's see the plan first of all. Now, we need to make sure that you add your voices to the conversation to make sure that we don't tax health care. And if you're going to repeal the Affordable Care Act, you come up with a better plan. Now, hopefully the effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act will fail, and we can focus on other issues like financial security of Americans by improving health care and making more affordable instead of turning the clock back. Unfortunately, if you're looking at retirement, there are attacks on retirement already. The fiduciary rule, which only requires people, when they go to a financial advisor, the financial advisor should have a fiduciary responsibility to do what's in your best interest, instead of looking at what's in their best interest. Now, we're only talking about retirement funds. We're talking about people that saved up over the years because they thought it was the right thing to do, and now they've got $500,000 in their fund and don't know the difference between a stock and a bond. All they know is they just set the money aside. You don't want a financial advisor to take advantage of people. You want them to give them advice that is in their best interest. That shouldn't be too hard, but that's what we passed that. They're trying to do away with that. They're trying to do away with the opportunity for people in states that have passed a law where you have the right to ask your employer to set aside a little bit into your personal IRA. There was a question of whether that conflicted with some federal tax law, and there's a regulation to make sure, to make it clear that it did not, that it's okay. You can have these kinds of laws. What happened? The House has already passed a law to overturn that, that regulation and put these kind of situations in flux again. It passed the House, so get over to the Senate to try to cut it off. There are other health issues that apply specifically to firefighters. The Fire Cancer Registry Act of 2017, there's a body of data that confirms what we already know, and that is that firefighters are at a much higher risk of contracting respiratory diseases, leukemia, or other kinds of cancer. We need to have a registry so we know what they are, and that will give us the opportunity to create a presumption that when you get these cancers, it was because you're a firefighter. Rather than sticking you with a bunch of litigation, that ought to be a presumption so you can start getting your benefits. There's also, we need better protection for firefighters. One of the most important things is adequate equipment and appropriate staffing. That's why we need to fund the Fire and Safer Acts. Now we have to also point out that these grants are in the non-defense discretionary part of the budget. If you're cutting taxes and increasing defense, this is the area that's going to be subject to the most cuts. So we need to make sure that as we talk about the budget, we don't cut the non-defense discretionary part of the budget, because that's where we get our fire and safer grants. With respect to workplace safety, I've co-sponsored the Protecting America's Workers Act with Congressman Joe Courtney from Connecticut to expand OSHA's authority to cover state and local government workers in those 24 states that don't have OSHA coverage today. You deserve protection of OSHA to make sure that you have a safe workplace, and if that bill passes, there'll be much better coverage for those workers. Speaking of OSHA, just last week, the House of Representatives voted on a virtual party line vote to back an OSHA rule that would ensure that OSHA could enforce an employer's obligation to record every serious workplace injury or illness on a log going back at least 5 years. This isn't just paperwork. We need that information to know who the good employers are and who they aren't. So make sure it's passed the House. So again, make sure you get over to the Senate to make sure that that bill doesn't pass. So here's what we know for sure. We need to work shoulder to shoulder as we face the continued threats in this Congress, the new administration, and potentially an anti-labor Supreme Court. Through all of this, I will continue to stand with our shared values and keep fighting for what we believe in, but it's your passion, energy, voice, and commitment is needed now more than ever. So continue to weigh in and be heard whenever our rights are at stake. Stay engaged, remain vigilant, and continue the momentum from this legislative conference throughout the year. And I'll be looking at all those rallies for those gold and black T-shirts to know that firefighters are in the House. Thank you. Keep up the good work. America is safer for what you do.
Thank you so much. I'll have to tell you my favorite white really story.